Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESG-CV past trainings webpage. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Next slide. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: ESG-CV updates, office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG-CV question and answer, and today's Spotlight Series presentation, new client file checklist. Next slide. On this slide, you will see our ESG policy documents, and once you receive the slide deck, you'll be able to access those links when needed. Next slide. And here are your ESG team representatives: Diana, Giovanni, Tuesday, and Anthony. Please reach out to your ESG representative listed above or contact us at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Next slide. Now for our ESG-CV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, all must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. And all final RFFs must be submitted to the department no later than November 15th, 2023. Next slide. Here are reminders while planning for our ESG-CV closeout. Spend down timing. Know when you're approaching the end. Know that most funds are due to be spent by September 30th, 2023. So don't spend too fast, but time it just right. Funding continuity, including HAP funding flexibility. Consider HAP funding and other funding streams that will allow you to continue to serve clients after closeout. Closing intake. Set dates and deadlines to stop accepting clients and client intake and prepare for final final rapid rehousing assistance. Staffing issues. Estimate declining caseloads for staff roles and workload. Just like we need to make sure we are not leaving participants with nowhere to go, we also want to make sure we're thinking of ways to keep our staff employed. Client issues, involving and informing participants well before end of assistance. Make sure you involve and inform participants timely before the assistance ends so they can prepare as well. No clients should become homeless because our program is in closing out. Next slide. Our upcoming office hours topics. April 26th, leases, habitability, and lead. May 3rd, rental assistance agreements. May 10th, rent reasonableness and fair market rent, rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. And May 17th, racial equity toolkit. Also, please see the links for the training site so that you can register for upcoming trainings as well as view past trainings. Next slide. Upcoming trainings for May. On May 2nd, documenting costs. This session will cover all of the basics needed to successfully submit an RFF to California HCD for payment. May 10th, data-driven decision-making. This session will explore use of data in everything from program design to racial equity. Next slide. Upcoming trainings for June. June 6th, rent reasonableness policy clinic. This session will review HUD's rules for rent reasonableness, learn about how to show rent reasonableness in California's higher priced housing market, and work together on the documentation required to complete a file. June 8th, HMIS Data Quality Program Management. This session will focus on the data quality aspects of completeness and accuracy. How much of the required data do you have in HMIS, and how much is the data you have a reflection of any given person's reality? Next slide. June 22nd. HMIS Data Quality Program Management. This session will review HUD's rules for rent reasonableness, learn about how to show rent reasonableness in California's higher priced housing market, and work together for that documentation. Do we have any questions at this time? We do have a question from Micah. Any thoughts on when ESG 2022 will be awarded? Connie, would you like to answer that?
Hi, everybody. ESG 2022, I know that they are getting very close to that. Don't have an exact date for you, but they are getting very close to. I can have, if you want to submit an email to the ESG NOFA box specifically, then that team should be able to reach out to you and give you a more definitive date.
Okay, and another question, Connie, also, is there an estimate of when the 2023 NOFA will be announced?
I know that has is in final review right now. So again, the ESG team will be communicating very shortly with everybody about when the NOFA will be released. So it's not, we're getting very close, but I don't have a date on that either.
Okay. Thank you. And once we get dates on those, of course, they will be sent out and communicated with you all. Next slide. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and you can contact your annual ESG representative or reach out via ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov. or reach out to your ESG-CV grant administrator for ESG-CV questions. Next slide. Now let's turn our attention to our new client file checklist being presented today by Joni.
Hi, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. So today's focus is trying to put together, we were trying to put together an easy way or a more user-friendly way for you all to satisfy the client file documentation requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so why? So there are quite a few requirements that come up overall for ESG and some additional ones for ESG-CV. But overall, why would you want to be looking at and having all these client file documentation? First, you want to have all the information together on eligibility, need, when you're evaluating participants for coming in and any sort of reevaluation, assistance provided and termination of assistance, so kind of the basics. But overall, big picture, This is about establishing documentation and kind of putting it together in an organized fashion for compliance. With the applicable ESG and ESG-CV and also the HCD requirements. But also it gives you a way for demonstrating that you're fitting in and complying with the community policies, priorities, and strategic resource allocation. It can give you something to make sure that for all your files, when you need it, you're able to kind of pull back and know that they're organized in a consistent manner and have everything that you need. Overall, having some strong client record keeping can help you in establishing accountability to the community and testing your system effectiveness and equity. Most importantly, are the people who are eligible for and need this assistance in the community, are they actually getting it? If you have strong client file records overall, you're able to see this. And it is something that you're able to search and pull from as needed in order to demonstrate that to your community that you're meeting the needs available. And it allows you to see overall, are you missing some groups of people, some geographic areas, and other things like that. Overall, it can help. We want to have efficient, strong practices that meet all the requirements, but we want to make sure that we're trying to not make it unduly burdensome or, really impractical to follow. That it's basically too hard to put all this stuff together. Next slide, please. Okay. So a basic overview of this are that, like the annual emergency grant program, overall, there are requirements for participant record keeping requirements for ESG-CV as well. So we want to make sure that we have appropriate records for all people who are assisted. What this means is not all people who just receive the ESG-CV assistance, but we're including in this some records for people that are screened and found ineligible as well. So those requirements are not going to be as extensive as those who you actually are providing the ESG assistance to, but there are some requirements that apply, namely those that show that around eligibility and need determinations, and documenting the reason the person might have been found to be ineligible. That's something that you do need to save, even if they are ultimately you're not assisting them. So what we'd like to do overall and encourage everyone to do is really try to look to available and existing documentation. There's quite a bit out there that we know that you all are doing overall and have access to. It's just part of your regular course of business in providing people with assistance and assisting people overall. We'd be looking at the HMIS records that are already existing when a client interacts with people in the system, looking at their discharge paperwork, and then going forward, the case management notes that you have there. Hopefully it's not a lot about creating extra stuff as it is more of an organizing tool. So this is going to be something that we're going to be looking at, a new client file policy and checklist that we've created to help you satisfy this. This is going to be something that we're looking to apply when it's available, to just go ahead and start using it on your clients going forward. Next slide, please. So what are the main requirements that we're looking to satisfy? So on this slide, as you can see, the main ones are going to be in the ESG interim rules. So you may be familiar with it from before, but the primary participant record keeping requirements are in one of the sections in 24 CFR 576-500. It's just basically a list that acts sort of like a checklist on that. It goes through eligibility, need, income, the services and assistance, and also if you ultimately need to terminate someone from assistance, what's actually required in that case? What do you have to document? What do you have to keep? In addition to that, there's also some component and activity specific requirements, such as different eligibility requirements that may apply if someone is receiving something like rapid rehousing assistance, homelessness prevention versus street outreach and, and emergency shelter, where you're going to have less, you're really looking to kind of serve the people there, and there's going to be less restrictions there. It also helps guide you in the timing of initial and any reevaluations later. Now for ESG-CV, this does modify, ESG-CV modifies some of the original ESG requirements. Some of them, for instance, like the applicable percentage of the area median income that you're looking at, the timing of periodic evaluations, things like that. And it also waives and adds others. For instance, one of the ones that it added was duplication of benefits analysis. So this is something that may overlap a bit with the needs analysis that you may be used to, but it is a specific thing that's included for ESG-CV. In addition to this, there are also going to be applicable policies that are going to come up from HCD as well. We've got a link there, and that has the list of all the different policies and resources that may apply, and some of the things, for instance, that you may have seen up there are going to be the housing stability plan and other things like that. So that are come up there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the client file policy, what is it? So overall, it's pretty simple. And this is going to be something, the policy is just going to be listed right on the checklist, so you can see it right there. And what we wanted to do is just that the policy overall is that you're going to be looking to satisfy your record keeping requirements by using the component specific client file checklist for each participant that is screened for assistance. So component specific, meaning that there are going to be different checklists to make it easier for you for street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing. So as you can imagine, the ones for street outreach and emergency shelter are, we try to keep it really to the bare bones there and try to keep those short. So you can kind of take a peek there, and we'll try to make it easy for you to have that. So they're intended to support you all in just making sure that you're obtaining client level documentation for each that satisfies each of the component requirements and the overall program requirements. So it is required for every entity that does receive ESG funding. And it just helps to guide, the checklist itself just helps to make sure that the client file contains all of the required information that are required from both HUD and HCD as well. There are also, so just to flag for you all, there are also a almost identical set of client file checklists that are created for the annual ESG as well to help you with that. And our hope is also that in using these client file checklists, it's also intended to be something that can be helpful as well for your monitoring and helping to organize your policy, your documentation. Next slide, please. Okay, the instructions. So these are also just right up at the top, and we will be previewing one of the checklists at the end, so we can walk you through it, but the instructions are just right up at the top along with the policy at the beginning. So pretty simple. Everybody just has a client file that contains all the information that's in the checklist. You basically, there are different things where you can check it off, put the dates, you gather the documents and just put the date that thing is completed. There's also a thing at the bottom where where there's some accountability mechanism. It shows the staff person that's completing it, that they have filled it out and signed it and dated it. So if somebody does need to kind of go back and find out more information, they know who to go to. There's also a spot for supervisor review, so a second level check on that as well. Next slide, please. And if anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to pop anything in the chat, and we'll also pause for questions in a bit. Okay. So overall, the checklist is divided into these key sections. Overall, not all of them are applicable to every component. case info, household info, eligibility, income and rent determination, component-specific activities, and termination of assistance. The one that we'll walk through at the end is a rapid rehousing specific checklist. That one will contain all of these. But as you can imagine, like I said earlier, the emergency shelter and the street outreach checklists are going to be a bit more streamlined. They're just going to have the case info, the household info, eligibility, and the specific activities that are required for emergency shelter and street outreach. Next slide, please. Case info. Great. So this is pretty straightforward. It's just basic info that helps to identify the relevant agency and the program involved here. It ties back to a client ID so that the actual, no PPI is included right on this checklist or anything like that. It uses the client ID instead of any kind of client name, and it's using the head of household client ID overall. And it's also tracking back to make sure that that the HMIS and program entry date is included in there, identifies which component, whether this is a client from emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention, and also the client status. If they're a new client, they're existing, or they're no longer a client. Next slide, please. Household info. Excuse me. In addition to confirming the documents that are in the file, these are the documents that can be sources that can to help complete the remaining checklist sections. So these are going to be, this is referencing HMIS intake and also coordinated entry screening intake forms. So this confirms that these are completed and these are in the file and someone has checked to make sure that they're in there, that the HMIS intake form includes all of the required HMIS data elements, and that HMIS release of information or its equivalent are included in the file as well. Next slide, please. Eligibility. So this is a pretty important section overall, especially for monitoring. So this is there's right here in this section for eligibility, it just confirms that the client meets the applicable eligibility criteria for the component for, say, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, street outreach, or emergency shelter. It goes through, since this is a pretty key, important section for monitoring overall, it goes through the definition overall for the participant definition that's required for that specific component. And it goes through the preferred order for documentation. And I see it looks like we have a question. Is there an HCD template that we can use and modify? We'll be previewing that at the end of this training overall, and it will be posted shortly. There is a non-component specific one that is posted online, but it probably is, it just includes everything, and it may be a little bit easier, particularly for street outreach and emergency shelter, to look at the briefer one. But, yeah, thank you. Okay, and overall, this will also go through some of the specific nuances overall. If someone is entering who is fleeing a domestic violence situation, there are slightly different documentation preferred order information for if you're entering from a victim service provider versus a non-victim service provider. And so that's included right there in the checklist, and it's meant to just be easy so you can kind of go through there, go through that and see that. This section also includes the need determination and the supporting documentation that are there. That's a critical part that comes up overall, and it's generally part of the intake, but just specifically highlighting that you are meeting that, and it gives you space there to show that that's in the file and that's been checked overall. as well as putting in that duplication analysis. And again, that duplication of benefits analysis may overlap commonly with the needs analysis, or it may help support it, but it is an ESG-CV specific requirement for homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. The checklist overall will help provide some resources that'll help guide that analysis, so you don't need to go hunting for it. Also, the other thing in this section overall, it will include a spot overall if somebody is found ineligible. And that's just making sure, again, as an extra reminder, that there still are some documentation requirements that are going to apply if someone goes through the initial screening process, but ultimately is found ineligible. It'll guide you through what you need to keep in the documentation, and mainly it's the reason that you found for them being ineligible and how that determination was made and what sort of supporting documentation that you used for it. Okay, I can see that we have another question overall from Amanda. If providers are already using their own checklists, would you recommend that they switch to the HCD template, or can they continue using their own checklists if they already included all the required documentation? Overall, Chris, do you want to weigh in on that perhaps?
I can weigh in. Thanks, Joni. Amanda, I would recommend using the HCD version for ease of monitoring. We are going to be looking at client records for monitoring moving forward in that order. And if it isn't in there, so we are saying in the client file checklist to use this version for ESG annual and ESG-CV funds. So I would recommend switching over. There's no hard requirement, like if we see it, you're not going to lose funding, but it will make your life easier, and it will ultimately make HCD's life easier as well.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide. Okay. So income and rent determinations. So these, again, are not going to be applicable for street outreach and emergency shelter, but are pretty important parts of homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. So with the section here, can you send a link? Sorry, one question. Please, can you send a link for the client checklist? So at the moment, we'll give you a preview at the end, and they are not yet posted, but they will be shortly, and a link to them will be, and they will be emailed out as well when they're ready to be posted. Yeah. Okay, back to the income and rent determination. So overall, this will be running through what you need to satisfy the requirements for the income eligibility and rent determination overall. So this would be, and the checklist, since there are slightly different requirements that do come up for homelessness prevention and for rapid rehousing for ESG-CV. It says overall, it says included in the checklist, for instance, what is the max area median income that applies and when you need to do it. If you need to do it just initially, and then when the timing of the reevaluations. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next section in the checklist is going to go over component specific activities. So these will be things that are going to, overall for all of them, you're going to have to document the services and assistance provided. And that includes for street outreach and for emergency shelter. For emergency shelter, in addition to that, you're going to have to show the payments and the proof and documentation overall. And in addition to that, homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, there are going to be some additional things that are going to be included, that like the rental related documents, and any other sort of housing related agreements, inspections, habitability standards compliance. And importantly here, one thing that it flags and it provides links and resources here are documentation to ensure that you're complying with the Violence Against Women Act requirements. It provides a link and information on the VAWA lease amendment that should be an addendum to the residential lease agreement. And the link that it includes is a sample that is listed on the HCD website as well. And for the services and assistance provided, it's also referencing back to the HCD housing problem solving policy that is on the HCD website. So that is asking that there are specific especially for street outreach and for emergency shelter, that there are specific services that are being offered, and to make sure that those are documented in the file. Next slide, please. And finally, there's termination of assistance. So this basically, if there is a client that you've made every effort to keep them in the program, but you do need to terminate their ESG-CV assistance, it just supports, there's information there that for the documentation that you'll need to have in the file. And for instance, and it just is a roadmap also that ensures that the proper process is followed and meets the requirements. So it supports that, for instance, they've received the notice of termination overall, if they have had a chance to an appeal, information on appeals was sent out to them, and if they have gone ahead and initiated the process for that appeals, what happened there, and any sort of documentation that supports that the notice was given, information about appeals was given to them if they needed to do that, and the results of that, that is listed there in the file. We're ready for the next slide. Okay, great. So from here, we'll go ahead and pull up, we walked you through the basics, but we wanted to make sure that you could go ahead and see what's down the pike here and show you an example of the checklist. We'll go through the one for rapid rehousing and give you the opportunity to take a look at it and answer questions. And just know that that will be coming out on the website shortly. And that we will also be emailing that out as well. Thank you, Chris, for noting, we're previewing the rapid rehousing client file checklist because that's kind of the lengthiest one and the most complicated one. So that may be the one where you do have questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and pull up the preview.
Joni, were you going to pull that up? Because we don't have that ready. I thought you were going to pull that up. Sorry about the confusion.
Okay, sorry, I did not know that, but I can. 1 second.
And while we wait, as Joni said before, we are diligently working on getting these posted. They're currently in the 508 process for compliance to be on the website. When we get that process done, and as the website's being updated, the annual representatives and the ESG-CV grant administrators will be sending this out. We'll also be sending out a listserv message through our constant contact that will have these as well. So you'll have them before they're posted on the website. I'm hoping next week at the latest. But again, this is kind of out of our control at this point. We were hoping to have them today, and obviously we do not. So I apologize for the delay, but we will get them into your hands as quickly as possible.
Do you see it? I hope.
Yep, got it.
Okay, great. Okay, So we will go ahead and just walk through this and just let me know if I'm going too quickly or there's something that we can't see overall in the screen. I'm just going to get some other stuff out of the way so I can see. Okay, great. So as you can see right up top here, this is just the policy and the instructions. This is overall, like we tried to keep it relatively simple. Here, there are links included. There are links included to different resources, and if you can see like a specific policy is cited that you wanted to get more information on there, like the HCD rapid rehousing policy, that's linked to it right there, and you can go ahead and click on that and see. But mainly the client file checklist overall is intended to just be consistent with meeting the client documentation requirements, and that's it. So as you can see, we kind of walked through each of the main sections, but you can see it right here. It's pretty, hopefully it's intended to be pretty simple and kind of hopefully as obvious as possible, but definitely let us know if you have different feedback on anything. So the case information, again, agency and program name, client ID, client status if they're a new client, if they're continuing or ineligible. And then when they're ineligible, you can kind of, there's going to be less stuff that you're going to have to fill out here. Application date, HMIS and program entry date, and then again, the component that is applicable here. Okay. The next section is the household information section. Again, this is going to guide you towards information that you that are both required, but hopefully other are going to be sources of information for you in finding that you've met different requirements. So there's going to be the HMIS intake form. When you do this intake form overall, and you're checking to confirm that it's in the file and date it, we have suggested that you review it and just make sure that all the required data elements are included there and have been entered. So that can be printed out and just included in the case file. An important one is just making sure that there is a release of information or its equivalent, that's included. Very important overall. If there are any questions, this provides a reference back to the HMIS manual where you can get different information. If you want to take a look at, for instance, what are the required data elements? If there are staff that aren't familiar with that or new staff, they can just go ahead and click on that link and take a peek. The next section here is just making sure that there is a documentation of screening or an intake form for coordinated entry. Everyone is required, there are the different, everyone is doing this intake and hopefully going through coordinated entry. And we're just making sure this helps make sure that you're documenting that you're complying with your community requirements to go through coordinated entry, as well as hopefully the written standards for assistance. The next section, again, this is a critical section overall. A lot of the different monitoring things that go on, different things that come up there and different findings or concerns come up with eligibility. So we want to make sure in this particular section overall that we really are looking over this and making sure that this information is in the file, and it's making sure that we're verifying that the appropriate homeless status is included for each of the components. So for rapid rehousing, for instance, we're looking for literally homeless category 1 clients. So we should be looking in the file and reviewing it at that point, and just making sure that they have a completed homeless verification form that would be, you'd be looking back to that coordinated entry system intake or HMIS form, that information is there, and that the staff person who's completing this is reviewing it for eligibility and compliance, and the supervisor, when they're taking a quick review, not quick actually, but hopefully when they're reviewing everything for compliance at the end, they're in particular paying a close attention to this eligibility requirements. It's also going through and just list it right here for ease, the preferred order for documentation. So again, if there is an availability third-party certification, that's available. And, that could be something as simple as HMIS. That's probably the easiest and simplest way that information is included in the file, and that's first priority. If that information is not available, then you'd be looking to have an oral statement that's signed, a case manager that they have written out and signed and dated in their oral statement. That is important, that these notes there, that the any sort of staff observation or written oral statement, that is signed and dated, and it identifies the relevant staff name and their position overall. It also provides here some information, just if somebody wants to go through and get some more specific information or has questions about looking in more detail about the different criteria, the different homelessness criteria. If you're not sure that a client really fits this definition, you can go back to any of these resources there and look at more information. So you can look, there are some some HUD resources here, as well as HCD specific resources on homelessness eligibility and documentation, and you can take a peek there. In addition to that, in many of the sections, so we've also included specific information, again, for clients fleeing domestic violence situations. These will have a different nuance to it and slightly different documentation things, because again, we don't want to be putting documentation requirements that are so onerous that they're really preventing clients from fleeing a dangerous situation. So right here, there are, it's listing the things that would meet all of the requirements here, and they will differ a little, as you'll see, from victim service provider intake to a non-victim service provider intake. Okay. And if anybody does have questions that are coming up through the chat, since I have this up, I'm not able to see it, so please feel free to just go ahead and interrupt me. That's fine. Okay, the next section is ineligibility. So again, this is something that just sometimes is overlooked overall, but it's just reminding us that if we're screening someone and they're going through the process for screening them overall and to be looking at them and they're ultimately found ineligible, we do have to still have a, maybe a more brief file of documentation on them, but we do need to keep some documentation for them. We need to have the determination and the documentation of the reason. So additional, if you want to look back to the specific requirements, again, there's links that are included here, but that one is fairly self-explanatory.
We do have a question, Joni, back on date. Let me go back to that. The date of the document, or is it the date of the file review? So this would be up at the top. I'm sorry, we just caught this one. My fault.
Date, this one right here, the program HMIS entry date.
I think just clarify both of those dates again, and that would be helpful.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So the question, oh, I see what you're saying, when it's spelled out. So this is going back to program and HMIS entry date at the very end of the checklist. I see, okay, so differentiating, so right here, this is when the client enters the program, and hopefully their data is entered on the same date or as close as possible. If that differs, you would note that there. The date of completing the checklist, that would be the space you would be putting that in is this space over here on the side, and you'd be, let's say it takes a little bit of time to kind of put the information together, complete the checklist. You just put the date right here, and then you've checked that it's in the file. When it's done, when the entire thing is done and somebody's ready to sign off on it, there's a space at the very end of the checklist. I'll just jump to it really quick. That the staff person has completed the form, the date, and then date of the review.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, So need. So here overall, again, this is in our initial eligibility section. So we do want to make sure, just like in the regular ESG program, that we're just making sure that the person does need the assistance. So that's overall the amount of assistance that they need, and the mix overall that they need to hopefully achieve permanent housing stability. So there's some more information listed in these resources for HCD specific resources, as well as the section overall. You can take a peek at the ESG interim rule to see what you need to satisfy there. Okay. Next is the duplication of benefits analysis. This will overlap or be part of the needs analysis, but again, we're just calling it out in particular. There are some specific resources that you can follow just to make sure that you have satisfied all of this. The duplication of benefits checklist and the duplication of benefits worksheet. This was probably a little bit more, it came up a little bit more earlier when there was also the emergency rental assistance program funding that came up. That was there at the same time, but this is still out there, so you can complete that. Okay, and it gives you some instructions on that. Okay, income and rent determination. So for rapid rehousing, slightly different. It's than for homelessness prevention. The income determination is going to be required annually and upon notification of income or circumstances that might affect your need for rapid rehousing assistance. So the documentation that you would be looking at is specified here. You'd be looking at kind of the priority. There's an priority order that's here, but you can follow that overall. So it gives you a chance to kind of make sure that all this information is in the file and take a peek as to see what type of income verification that was involved here, whether it was written, oral, part of staff observation, or self-certification. It lists the specific AMI income limit that you'd be looking at to continue receiving the assistance, and just gives you some basic examples of written third-party documentation that come up. Again, easier ways to just satisfy this, be looking at pay stubs, tax returns, benefits notices, bank statements, and other income statements. In addition to that, you've got some resources here that may be helpful to make that determination for the area, since the AMI locally changes over time, and the HUD income calculator. Okay, any questions? Are we okay?
Nope, we're going well in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so rapid rehousing activities. So this will be longer than the street outreach and the emergency shelter program. A lot of these are going to be the specific requirements that come up in regards to rental documentation. So there's going to be more that come up when we are funding actual housing for units. We want to make sure that it's complying with all the agreement with the standards as well, that we're putting people into units that are safe and habitable and things. So we also, and that we're making sure that the clients that we're assisting are being treated in ways that are fairly overall and meeting minimum standards. So we want to be looking to make sure that there is a rental lease agreement between the participant and landlord, or an allowable and legal sublease that's overall. We want to make sure that it is actually enforceable. It's signed by both of them. It's dated, and it also, a very important one, that it addresses late payment requirements. So that comes up quite a bit. If something is late or there are different things in there, that it's very clearly in the lease agreement that it's what happens there. And then looking at the lease agreement that's there, taking a peek at it, making sure it's at least 3 months. And so if you want more information and you're not sure whether or not the rental lease agreements that you have, whether it complies, you can go ahead and check this resource right there, and that can help you in your review. The next section covered is the Violence Against Women Act documentation. Again, this is a pretty important thing that comes up in monitorings overall. So we want to make sure to call out your attention to this, particularly this first link here. On the HCD website, there is a VAWA lease amendment that should be included as an addendum to the residential lease agreement. So if that's something that you haven't had an opportunity to see and take a peek at, we would definitely encourage you to go on the HCD website and start incorporate and make sure that you're incorporating that into the residential lease agreements. In addition to that are different, the notice of occupancy rights that is given out, as well as other information that comes up. And if you'd like to get some more information on, what's involved as far as compliance with all of the Violence Against Women Act changes, there's an HCD resource, that VAWA compliance policy, that is posted on there. Next is the rental assistance agreement. Again, that's signed by all the relevant parties. We want to make sure that for the rental assistance, again, this is the earlier one, the residential lease agreement, that's the right to be in the actual unit. The rental assistance agreement will cover the payment terms. We want to make sure that this is consistent with the lease. It should have the same payment due date, the same grace period, the late payment requirements. We really want to just check and make sure on that, and make sure that those are consistent. The amount should be very clear, especially the amount that's going to be paid by the program participant owner, and the amount to be paid by the program. This needs to be executed before any payments are made to the owner. So making sure that we have these two agreements in particular, and that they're consistent with each other and very clear overall, is definitely important overall for monitoring, but also just making sure to help kind of head off problems before they arise. A lot of things come up sometimes with late payments, grace periods, and who pays what. And so making sure that those agreements are looked at and it's very clear and checked off there, definitely again, heads off some of these problems before they come up. All right. So landlord incentives. If you are, landlord incentives is part of the package that you are giving, and landlord incentives are something that you're doing. You want to make sure that you have the information that's in there. It also specifies the maximum amount of landlord incentives that are permitted, 3 months of rent. And it complies with the community's existing landlord incentive policy. And just, for the W-9, this is just something that you may need for processing payments to the landlord. So that just helps in making sure that that's there, so that that goes smoothly and that there's no hiccup in getting the payments out, and making sure that the client can stay in the housing and no delay there.
Joni, I'm sorry to take you back a little bit. Can we go back to the lease length section for a moment? I know it's not too far back, but I was doing.
Yep.
So we have a question about the 3 months. That means we can't do month to month rental agreements.
Okay. You know what? I'm gonna have to look back on that. Sorry, I don't.
All right, no worries. Keep going. I think it's Sequacia. We will. Can you drop your email? Oh, go ahead, Erin. Sorry.
I just checked. It actually is month to month. So we will probably have to adjust that on the checklist.
Okay.
So Sequacia, you can do month to month leases.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for catching that. Okay, great. All right, unit eligibility. So overall, a lot of things come up with lead-based paint. So again, depending on your area, this comes up. It's very common, and when you live in an older unit, whether or not it's been freshly painted, or definitely if it's not freshly painted, for something that there are chips there, particularly if there are children, young children who are under age 6, or if there are pregnant women that are going to be in the unit. You want to make sure that you're satisfying all the lead-based paint requirements. So it just outlines here some of the different disclosure pamphlets and the visual assessment certification form. With this overall, if there's any questions on this, we would definitely encourage you to look at the different resources here and to utilize the specific forms that are there and walk through that. So that comes up quite a bit. In fact, I just found out I have some lead that I did not realize was there, even though everything's painted, but it definitely comes up when you don't necessarily expect it. Okay, habitability standards. So right here, this is a great spot overall for the habitability stuff. There's a lot of different resources and sample checklists that are listed here, and we would encourage you to utilize. There's an HCD sample checklist, for instance, in looking at the housing habitability standards and the forms. So just kind of keeping in mind that this is something that does have to be completed, whether a household is remaining in the existing unit or moving to the new unit. So we'd encourage you to utilize those checklists and those forms there. Rent reasonableness, there's a certification form, again, that's linked. The file does need to document rent reasonableness, including the dates of comparison. We would encourage you to take a peek and look through the HCD fair market rent and rent reasonableness policy. Go ahead and take a peek through that. And payments. So we definitely, this is another key, a key area for monitoring and just making sure that as the that our payments are going back and forth, that we definitely are keeping the proof that the rental assistance are made to the owners on behalf of the participants. We want to make sure it's very clearly identified in the file, the dates and the term of the payments that are covered, the dates that are of occupancy by the program participants, and that it's consistent with the other supporting documentation in there, that it tracks back to your lease and your rental assistance agreement. And that information, it's that has been reviewed, and the person who's checking this, just make sure that that ties back. Okay, the next bit relates a bit more to the services and the linkages that are provided. So this is going to be more the case management. This is the housing stability plan. Overall, this is making sure, again, that we're looking back to the housing focused case management overall from that HCD requires, that we're satisfying that, and that the person who's reviewed this just makes sure that the appropriate services have been provided for that. That's the rapid exit services, for instance, and that there's other documentation in there for any sorts of payments or amounts or anything like that as far as services that are provided. And it takes a peek as to what what the documentation should be include. We would just point out that, for instance, that the documentation should be in the file. It also should be in HMIS. So another easy way of making sure that this is satisfied, I mean, there can be the HMIS printout showing some of the documentation and the assistance that's provided in there. Okay, and just a reminder that's bolded, ESG-CV clients can't be required to participate in services to receive assistance. So just keeping that in mind overall, and that monthly case management requirement is waived. All right, financial assistance. So again, just like payments made for rent, we want to make sure that there's appropriate documentation for any any financial assistance that is provided. It should show the type and the amount of financial assistance that is provided, and to who's that, and give sufficient detail to basically describe what it's for. So if you're looking at the receipt for, if you have some sort of detail that's provided, just make sure that there is sufficient detail in there that it actually describes what it is that you can, someone would be looking at this and they're making sure that we're meeting the requirements overall, that it's not vague, it's not fuzzy, and again, that it includes those important details, who it was paid to, the amount and the type. All right, next section is reevaluation. So again, we're looking at sometimes at initial evaluation, reevaluation. So this is just making sure that the date is just very easily included on there, that the record was reviewed and reevaluated, including the date, and just highlights really quick, highlights which sections were updated, what changed. So for instance, if need changed or anything like that, that it's just calling that out right there. Okay, and the last section again is finally termination of assistance. This may or may not be applicable, but if it is, that you're making sure that that information is included in the file. And that's pretty much it. Then there's just a space to sign it and date it. Okay. I think that's it from me. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Well, thank you, Joni. I know we have a last question that we're going to address in our follow-up email, but thank you all so much for attending today's session. Thank you, Joni, for a great presentation. Look for the materials in your email soon. And remember that there will be a survey as you exit this session. Please take time to answer that, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.